Welcome back. This video we're going to talk about pre-installation prep. What do we have to have done before we can proceed into the full installation of Exchange 2007? First, we're going to talk about hardware requirements. They always are part of the equation. That's RAM, processor, disk requirements. Once we're done there, we're going to talk about the infrastructure that needs to be in place. One part of that infrastructure that's going to matter a lot in the future is physical disk configuration. Do we have mirrors set up for disaster recovery? Do we have some sort of quickly accessible RAID array, like a RAID 5 with multiple disks in it? What's the optimum configuration for that? We'll touch on those things. As far as DNS setup, we'll have both the internal side of DNS and the external side of DNS to talk about. Initially, we're going to talk about internal, and we'll touch on external a bit later. Once that's complete, we'll go into Active Directory installation. How do you build an Active Directory on a server that we've got set aside to be a domain controller? Well, we're going to run dcpromo, and then we'll go ahead and verify that our Active Directory has been properly created. After that, we're going to register our external domain name on GoDaddy and do some DNS configuration there. After we've finished talking about the infrastructure, we're going to go ahead and talk about requirements for existing Active Directories and for older Exchange orgs. Maybe you already have an Active Directory with some Windows 2000 domain controllers, maybe even an NT domain controller. And maybe you also have an Exchange organization that's older than 2007. Maybe you had Exchange 2000 or 2003 running. Well, this will be the time where we talk about what needs to happen to upgrade. Next, we'll look at some Active Directory schema changes. These are changes that need to be made to the Active Directory to allow Exchange 2007 setup to properly store certain types of information in the Active Directory. Once that's done, we really should be able to go ahead and install Exchange 2007, but we're going to open up the Exchange Best Practices Analyzer and run a readiness scan, which will go ahead and verify whether we really are prepared to do the installation, and we'll follow up on any items that it lets us know that we still need to take care of. Now you'd think we're almost done, but we've got one more thing to cover. We're going to be talking about the editions, Standard Edition versus Enterprise Edition, and also about the client access license types so that you can have your head on straight when you end up having to make decisions about which edition to buy and which client access licenses you need. All right, so now let's go on into requirements. And over time, we've started to get a bit skeptical about hardware minimum requirements because they tend to be lower than the normal person would actually want to run something on. But in the case of Exchange 2007, the minimum requirements are actually fairly significant and will result in pretty decent performance. Let's start with the processor. A 64-bit processor is the requirement. 32-bit is not an option. The processor can be either an AMD or Intel processor, but if it's an Intel, it needs to be an EMT64T processor, not an Itanium processor. As far as the RAM goes, the general rule of thumb is that 2 gigs of RAM plus 5 megs per mailbox is going to be what you need. So for 200 users at 5 megs a piece, that's going to be about an extra gig added to our requirement. So 2 gig 200 users comes to 3 gigs. All that being said, the more memory you can put in this system, the better. Because the system is 64-bit, the memory space and the ability of the operating system to use memory is greatly expanded. So having 6 gigs, 8 gigs, 12 gigs, 16 gigs is not going to be that unusual in Exchange 2007 production environments. The more memory you put in the system, the less frequently the Exchange server components actually have to read data off the disk, the more often they're going to be finding it in RAM cache, which is going to create a very large performance increase. All right, as far as the footprint for installing this thing, of course you're going to need quite a bit of room for databases, and we'll talk about that soon. But initially, when you first set up Exchange 2007, right out of the box, you're going to be looking at 1.2 gigs taken up on whichever disk you choose to install the programs on. I'm sorry to say the program files. So if you install it on the D drive, it's going to use 1.2 gig of the D drive. Now, no matter where you install it, in addition to this 1.2 gig, you're also going to be using up 200 megs on the system drive. So if you install Exchange 2007 on D, you're still going to use up an extra 200 megs on C just due to new DLLs, schema changes, extra information that ties into the operating system. So a total of 1.4 gigs. All right, as far as software goes, we've got two things we need to talk about. One is the actual server itself that we're going to be installing Exchange on, but the other is the domain controller, or a domain controller. This is to say that one of the domain controllers in your existing domain, if you have one, needs to be running Windows 2003, Service Pack 1, or R2. I guess I can write that in here. R2. Remember R2. It doesn't have to be all of the domain controllers in the domain running SP1 or R2, but one of them needs to be. And that domain controller also needs to wear the Schema Master hat. It's kind of a way of describing the role that it plays, and we'll go into checking if it's wearing that hat later. And it also has to be a global catalog server, both of which you'll see us check on the status of at a future time here. As far as the actual server that you're going to install on, it needs to be a Windows 2003 64-bit OS with Service Pack 1 or R2 installed on it. These next three items, .NET Framework 2.0, MMC 3.0, and PowerShell, all these three are going to be installed as part of the Exchange 2007 setup wizard. It doesn't actually install them automatically, but it gives you options and direct links to the download site. So we'll actually install them during the main setup. And lastly, we need to install Internet Information Server, or IIS as it's normally called. Now, it needs to be installed without SMTP or NNTP. If you've installed Exchange 2003 before, or another earlier version of Exchange, you'll note that you always installed IIS with SMTP and NNTP. SMTP is Simple Mail Transport Protocol. It's the protocol that's and service that's in charge of really all the communication and delivery of mail out on the internet, reception and delivery. And NNTP is a news service protocol. Now in the past, we would use the SMTP stack or protocol that came with IIS, and it was built by the Windows Server Group. But this time, the Exchange group built their own SMTP service instead of using the one that came with IIS. So they're asking you that when you do install IIS, which is a requirement, do not install SMTP or NNTP. If they are installed, you'll have issues. Actually, I think the setup will not continue if you don't have them if you have them set up. Last thing to cover, all locations, all disks that you're going to write Exchange data to need to be formatted with NTFS. Not reformatted, but originally formatted with NTFS. So the drive that you put your OS on, your installation files on, so that would be the C or the D drive typically, and the drive that you put your log files on, the drive that you put your database files on, all of those need to be formatted NTFS. All right, let's move on to planning how we're going to actually set up our disks. All right, let's talk about disks. I'm going to go through some best practices here, but I want to make sure you understand why they're the best practices. There's a lot of talk about the difference between hardware RAID solutions and software RAID solutions. Hardware RAID solutions is when you add a card to your server that pretty much takes care of all the processing and the controlling and the sending back and forth of data to the disks. It also, specifically with a RAID card, make sure that the operations that are coordinated between multiple disks are done in a smooth way, and that the processing of those operations happens on the card rather than it being another burden on the actual main processor that the OS is running on. If you run a software RAID, you end up basically handling your RAID array and your RAID processing as another software process in the operating system. And that can be a lot of overhead, especially if one of your disks in your RAID 5 array goes out and all sorts of extra calculations need to happen. you could see a really massive slowdown in the way your operating system functions because it's trying to do a lot of extra work at that point. Generally, all serious servers use hardware RAID solutions, although it's possible if you're doing testing or setting up a lab or something to go with a software RAID just to get the job done. Another thing that's interesting to talk about is the fact that it's the spindles, the number of disks that are part of an array, not the size of the disks, that's the critical function of how fast an array is. If I have an array, and when I'm talking about arrays right now, I'm talking about arrays of 3 or more disks. If I have an array of 6 disks, and each disk is 100 gigs, then put them all together in a RAID 5 array, and I've got 500 gigs of storage. Now you might say, well, why spend the money on 5 or 6 100 gig disks when you could have spent the money on 3 200 gig disks and only spent about 60% of the cost? Well, the reason why is the more disks you have, the less information needs to be read off each disk when an actual read or a read operation happens, and then the less information needs to be written to those disks when a write operation happens, because the actual data that gets written to the disk is spread out and separated over all of them. That's why a RAID 5 array is faster the more disks it has, because basically many hands make light work. Now sure, it takes up less space in your server case and uses less power if you have fewer disks, and it actually costs less. But you need to weigh what's your goal. Is it to save space and save energy, or is it to provide fast and redundant access to your data? So that's the deal on spindles. Now, all that being said, spindles were more important in previous versions of Exchange than this version, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the increased ability to address large amounts of memory that 64-bit architecture brings. The fact that I can put 12 gigs of RAM in the server means that the page files, and in fact the data itself, isn't going to be read from the disk as much, because as much as possible, some of the software subsystems in the operating system are going to try and keep the critical data that needs to be read up to the minute. They're going to keep that data as much as possible in RAM, so that that data can be served out from memory at 10 times or probably 100 times faster than it could be read from the array. So I'm saying two things here. If you're planning RAID 5 arrays, you want a fast array, go for more disks. But at the same time, you're going to notice that your ability to add more RAM in Exchange 2007 brings with it less reliance on the actual speed of the disk subsystem. All right, let's move on here. How do we actually divide our data among different disks that we've got? Well, on this particular server that I've kind of made a diagram of here, we've got 2 SATA, dual channel SATA controller cards. Each one of these is its own SATA channel, and each of these channels could hold 2 or more disks on it. So what we've done is we've used this card to put one mirror set on it and another mirror set on this. And what we've basically done is on this mirror set, there's 2 disks put together. Each disk has the exact same data in case one of them goes bad. We basically put both the C drives and the D drives on this pair of disks. And the C is going to have the boot and the operating system, whereas the D drive is going to hold the program files directory that we install different things on. Antivirus, if we're running antivirus on the server, we're going to put the Exchange program subdirectory there. Different programs and applications we install will be there. Now, we've got to put transaction logs somewhere, and transaction logs are pretty much logs that are heavily read and written to during the normal course of Exchange behavior. And transaction logs are also important because they're vital to have in the event of some sort of crash or emergency. So 2 reasons. One, it's good to keep them separated from the mirror set, because since so many reads and writes go to them, we don't want to have our operating system stuff and our page files that might be located here interfering with disk access to these transaction logs. The other reason why we want them separated, especially from the databases, is if the disk array that the databases are on crashes and goes bad and we want to do a restore, the last good backup we did, plus all of the transaction logs since that backup, are what we need to bring a restore right up to the minute that the actual crash happened. So keeping them on a different set of disks is very wise because you're less likely to lose all of them at once. We don't use so many transaction logs, and they're not so large that we really need to keep them on a completely new RAID 5 array. Really, if you had 20 to 40 gigs set aside for transaction logs, that would be enough. So really, you could use this E drive for some other bits of static data. Say you have install files for some things you don't use that often, like printer drivers, things like that. You could put them on this E drive and you wouldn't really have any performance loss, and it would use some of that extra space. So that's generally how we do it. Depending on the size of your business, you're going to be wanting more or less space on this D drive. I would say keep at least 150, 200 gigs free. The database limit for Exchange used to be 16 gigs, and then they raised it to 75 gigs later on once Service Pack 2 for Exchange 2003 came out. But now for Exchange 2007, there is no database limit anymore. So if the sky's the limit, then you should expect that with 64-bit hardware and no ceiling on the size of your databases, conceivably you might be running the server in 5 or 6 years. So think about what that accumulated data might end up looking like. All right, let's go on to DNS setup. There's two areas of name resolution that we need to look at. First is the external. We need to make sure that clients and hosts and servers out on the internet can find this server properly. So we're going to need to make sure that the DNS is properly set up on the outside or external world. We also need to make sure that internal name resolution is set up properly so that we can get a good Active Directory installed and that we can also resolve the name of the server from clients that are inside connecting via Outlook. Now, most commonly, domains that are in the external world are going to use a public address suffix like .com, .net, .org, .biz, or .gov. And internally, we're going to use a private address suffix like .local, .inside, .internal, you name it. But there's actually a pretty good case to be made for using your public address suffix internally as well. So you'd be .com on the outside and .com on the inside. It makes several things simpler, but in this situation for this class that we're doing here, we're going to just use the .local as our internal naming scheme. First thing we're going to do is get DNS set up on the future domain controller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. What I've got up here are two shortcuts. These are both remote desktop protocol shortcuts, and using them will open up remote desktop and connect to that server. This is the server we've already set up to run Exchange 2007 on. And this is the one we've earmarked to be our domain controller. So I'm going to have to validate here. Click on yes. And once this comes up, first thing I'm going to need to do is make sure that DNS is installed here. All right, let's go here into Control Panel, go to Add and Remove Programs. We're going to look at Add and Remove Windows Components. And once this next screen comes up, we're going to go into the networking portion, and we're going to choose DNS. So here's networking. Let's go into Details, choose Domain Name System, and click OK. Let's do Next. And I'm going to go ahead and pause the video while this thing loads. All right, there we go. Let's go ahead and finish that up. And now let's go back and open up the DNS administrator, which should be in the admin tools now. And let's go ahead and connect. Okay, here we are. Now, if we look in the forward lookup zones folder, we see that there's actually no zones existing right now. Either are there in the reverse lookup zone. We could actually start here and create zones for the domain that we're going to be creating. But actually the easiest way to get this thing set up is to just leave things as they are here in DNS and allow DC Promo to automatically connect to this DNS server and populate it with the records that need to be there. So I think that's what we're going to do here. Let's go ahead and get back to our outline. Note that the next thing we want to do here is go ahead and configure the local adapters. So what we need to do is make sure that this future domain controller is pointing at itself for DNS. So let's go take a look at that. Go here into Control Panel, go to Network Connections, Local Area Connection. And if you look at this here, we see the IP address is set to 2. We've got an external DNS server configured in here right now. Let's go ahead and change that out for the local IP address of this server. Now you might ask yourself, if this system is pointed at itself and there aren't any zones in the DNS like we saw earlier, will this server go ahead and resolve names? That's a good question for you. Let's go ahead and pull up a command line and type actually let's do a ping www.terrainsignal.com. Notice that we do get a reply. We've got name resolution. The reason why that works is that every server, when you install DNS, at least every Windows 2000, 2003 server, has what's called a root hints file, which helps the server find the root DNS servers out on the internet so that any query they want to make can be made properly. So at this point, we're pretty good to go as far as the DNS. And the fact that it's pointed at itself means that when we run DC Promo like we want to do, we won't have to do anything special to build those records. We're already ready to go on that. All right, so forward lookup zones, we're going to see those get created by DC Promo. Reverse lookup zone, we'll create that on our own a little bit later. External DNS configuration. We can't really do much with that until we've actually registered our domain name. So what we're going to do next is just jump into the Active Directory section of this. Notice that the first thing on our list is to run DC Promo. So let's head right back there and do that. It's pretty simple. I'm just going to type DC Promo. And what happens is it starts up the Active Directory installation wizard. I'm going to go ahead and click Next and Next. We are setting up a domain controller for a new domain, not adding one to an existing domain. And this domain that we're setting up is not going to be a child of a domain that already exists. It's just going to be the top of a new forest. And here's where we put in the name of the new internal domain. So we're going to call this domain 3cg.local. It's going to be our internal domain name. All right, now we're going to specify the NetBIOS name. We're going to go with the default here, which is just 3CG local without the .local on it. It's going to ask us where we want to put the Active Directory database and the log files. These locations are just fine. And the sysvol location is fine as well. From here, this is where we actually get to have DC Promo automatically configure our domain. We basically are going to leave this checked, install and configure DNS on this computer, and set this computer to use this DNS server as preferred. It's basically already installed. It's already pointed at itself. The only thing it needs to be done is configure. So if we go ahead and do next, it's going to go ahead and take care of the last things that we didn't do. And this screen basically asks, hey, do you have client operating systems that are earlier than Windows 2000 in the domain? And since this is just an XP and Vista shop, we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to leave this one checked. And at this point, we can throw in a password and go forward. All right, this is basically a summary of what we're going to be doing. We pretty much know what it says. And this process is going to take a little while, so I'm going to pause this and I'll pick it up again when it stops. All right, now we're finished. Let's go ahead and restart the server. Let's review where we've been and where we're going. First, we're going to confirm that Active Directory was actually created. We'll see whether we need to Active Directory integrate DNS, whether we'll have to go ahead and make it happen or whether it's already happened. We'll then check the role of the server and make sure that it's wearing the Schema Master and Global Catalog role hats, as I guess we just call them hats sometimes, since they can be moved around between different servers if you've got multiple domain controllers. And then once we've done those things, we'll actually create a few test users on the server. Okay, let's go back to our domain controller. All right, the first thing we want to do is notice that in DNS, we've got two zones created. The first zone, _msdcs.3cg.local, is created basically to hold all sorts of the Active Directory information. LDAP records, records that systems get returned from DNS when they're looking for a domain controller. We've also got our 3cg.local domain, and this domain up here is a subdomain of that. If we click on 3cg.local, we see that we've got our SOA record, which is a normal record to have in a zone. We've got one name server, and it's this server. We've got our domain controller here. So it looks like that's pretty much set up. We do want to configure a reverse lookup zone at this point. We're going to click New Zone. We're going to make it a primary zone. And we're going to leave this the same way it is. It's going to replicate to all domain controllers. And we have to type in the network ID of the zone, and it's going to reverse that. So we're going to do 192.168.67 is our domain here. And we're going to go ahead and click Next on that. We'll just leave the default settings on this and go ahead and finish that up. Now notice that we've got another reverse lookup zone made with an SOA record and a name server record. Over time, this will get populated with the IP addresses of our clients and of the Exchange server once it's installed, and of the domain controller itself in a little bit. Now, if I go to one of these zones, for example, 3cg.local, and I right-click it, I can go into Properties and find out if this zone is stored in a file or in the Active Directory. And this says that the type is Active Directory integrated. If I click Change, I have an option to change this zone storage type and not stored in the Active Directory. Now we're just going to leave that checked, but if I didn't leave that box checked, it would actually pull it out of the Active Directory and write it to a file on disk here. Okay, so we've looked at that. The next thing we want to do is ensure that this domain controller has the Schema Master and the Global Catalog roles. So to do that, we're going to use a tool called Active Directory Sites and Services. It's in the admin tools. All right, we're going to open up this. We're going to go into default first site name, drill down to the server, drill down below the server to this NTDS settings. We're going to get properties on that. And first thing we're going to notice is that we do have the Global Catalog checkbox checked. All right, so that's the Global Catalog. The next thing we need to do is check for Schema Master role. To do that, we're going to actually load a special tool here. We're going to go to Start and Run. Type MMC here. Okay. And this is going to bring up a Microsoft Management Console that's blank. We want to add a new snap-in. And on this screen, we're going to click Add. Now, the snap-in we want is called Active Directory Schema. The reason this is in the list, and normally it's not actually, is because I went into the command line a bit earlier, and I just typed regsvr32 schmmmgmt.dll. Doing this registers the schema management DLL to allow you to add that Active Directory schema snap-in. If you don't do this command here, you will not be able to see this item in the list as available. Let's go ahead and add that and go ahead and OK that out. And we're going to look in here. We're going to go down into, we're going to right click actually this and choose Operations Master. Notice that it says that the current schema master online is this system, 3cg dc.3cg.local. Now if you had multiple domain controllers, you'd still be able to load this console on any one of them and right click, get properties, or actually right click and choose what was that? Operations Manager from this and tell who the schema master is. So now we've verified that. The one other way to tell that a system is set up properly to be a domain controller is just go to a command line on that server and type net share. If you see that there is a net logon share and a sysvol, that usually means that the domain controller setup has properly completed on this server. Because a lot of times if something screws up during the DC promo, these two shares that are critical to it being a domain controller don't actually get created. Next thing we're going to do is go ahead and create some user accounts. So we're going to open up Active Directory users and computers. And we're going to drill down into the users folder. And right now it's just the default users that get created. We're going to go ahead and click on create a new user here. And we'll build a user for myself, David Shackelford. And I'm just going to use dshack for my login name and set my password up. And we'll go ahead and keep it from expiring and finish that up. My password wasn't complex enough. Well, we'll fix that, won't we? Let's change that and change that. See if that takes care of us. Okay, good. There we go. I'm going to create one more user. And this user is going to be someone very special. Let's do something nerdy here and do Gandalf de Grey. And we'll call him Gandalf here. Let's change that. Add a password here. Something complex this time. And let's have that one not expire. Normally we wouldn't be doing this, but in this situation I don't want to worry about that expiring later. Notice that it's creating a username. This username is also going to usually be the prefix for any email address that we set up later. Okay, we've got the two users created. Let's head back to our outline so that we can move on. All right, the next thing to do on our list is actually register a domain. So first we're going to basically go to the GoDaddy site and register a new domain name. Let's head over there right now. And I'm going to go ahead and log into my account. But I'm actually going to pause this video and continue after I've already gotten in. All right, let's go ahead and register a domain. What we're going to do here is put in the domain that we're going to register. And what we're going to put here is cashcow capitalgroup.com. Whoops, let's leave the .com off. Do a search. And our name that we want is available. We're going to go ahead and not select all these other options. We're just going to move all the way down to continue. and always tries to sell you all sorts of things. We're just going to continue to check out. We're going to go on a 2-year registration. It's fine. We're going to not do an auto renew because I don't want to be billed for it in 2 years. And we are going to move down to make sure that we've just got a standard registration. We don't need any of these other things. And let's go ahead and check out. When we get to the point where I need to put in my payment details, I'm going to go ahead and pause this. But up till then, we should be doing this together. Looks like I'm about ready. Unit price, 2 years, that's fine. That's 2 years on that domain name. We're going to go ahead and continue. Check out now. Oh, I have to check these agreement boxes. Okay, let's check out. And I'm going to go ahead and put my billing information in here. All right, I can click checkout now. Okay, got to key in this thing here. Verify that. We should be ready to go. Okay. So what I can do a little later is log on to the account and actually do some work with the DNS. But let's go back to our setup and see what we're going to do next. Okay, our next step is actually to set the DNS settings up at GoDaddy. So let's go back and we're going to go into domains and we're going to go into My Domains. And we're going to choose Cash Cow Capital Group. And we're going to go into Total DNS Control and MX Records. What we're going to do here is look and note that we've got a lot of records populated already. We've got a mail record, a pop record, and all of these records point to GoDaddy's own resources and services. So we're going to be needing to make some change here. Note that mail, the MX records for this domain are automatically, there's 2 of them. One points at the main SMTP server alias at a secureserver.net, which is GoDaddy's network. And the other record, which is a priority 10, meaning it's going to be used less often actually, is pointed to mail store 1. What we're going to be doing is creating new A records. And this A record is going to be cow mail, so that it doesn't conflict with any of the other mail records there. The IP address we're going to point it to is 67.168.84.33. Actually, I'm going to make that 184. And that IP address is actually an IP that I'm using for this network. And we're going to leave the time to live as it is. This basically says, how long can this record, if someone asked DNS who is Cowmail, got this IP address, how long can they keep that record before they need to throw it out and ask that question again? And we've said an hour is fine. So I'm going to click OK on that. So now we've got a record for Cowmail. What I'm going to do now is go down into MX. I'm going to add a new MX record here. Let's set the priority of this one to 0, which means it's the highest priority. The host name, we're just going to put an @ sign there, which means that we're looking to use this MX record for all mail coming to this domain, cashcowcapitalgroup.com. We don't need to put anything else there. On the goes to address, we don't put an IP address here. We actually just reference the A record that we created earlier. So here we're going to put cowmail.cashcowcapitalgroup.com. And from here, we'll leave the time to live at an hour, and we'll go ahead and click OK on that. And if we look down here at our MX records, notice that we've got an MX record, and it's pending setup right now, but it'll kick in later. So we'll come back and deal with this a while later after the actual Exchange setup, but we just wanted to make sure that this was taken care of. So just to review, A records, they map names to IP addresses, whereas MX records make mail for a domain go to a specific named host. So when I create an MX record, I have to specify the actual domain, and I also have to specify the named host. That's why we set up the A record first, mapping cowmail to its IP address, and then we specify the @ sign in that record saying this domain going to a specific named host, which in this case was cowmail.cashcowcapitalgroup.com. The next place to go as far as our coverage is going to be the Active Directory requirements. We need to do two things. First, we need to make sure that domain functionality level is at least Windows 2000 native or higher. Now, if we've just set up our domain, that functionality level is already going to be set to native or higher. So that's not really going to be an issue here, but I'll show you where to look for that. The other thing I want to talk about was whether you can run Exchange 2007 on a domain controller. Let's quickly check the domain functionality level first, and then we'll come back to that second question. So looks like we've got to log back in here, and we're going to go to Active Directory Domains and Trusts, and we're going to right-click the domain, and we're going to choose Raise Domain Functionality Level. At this point, we're already really set to Windows 2000 native. We could move on up, but since the minimum requirement here is 2000 native, we're just going to leave it at that. If we do move up to 2003, that will not allow us to have Windows 2000 domain controllers in our domain. All right, let's head back. Okay, if we want to run an Exchange 2007 server on a domain controller, it is supported by Microsoft, but it's definitely not one of their best practices. They actually advise against it, but here's the skinny. Once you have Exchange 2007 running on a domain controller, you cannot do another DC promo on that box and have it not be a domain controller. If you do, that's going to mess up a lot of settings within Exchange 2007. So the basic rule is this. If you want to run Exchange 2007 on a domain controller, you should make the system a domain controller before you put Exchange 2007 on it. Because either making it a DC or telling it not to be a DC while Exchange 2007 is on it is a bad thing. So that's basically the long and short of that. Okay, let's go look at the schema changes that need to be made to the Active Directory. Now before I go into these, let's talk a little bit about schema. I've been using that term and I haven't really defined it. Schema, let's say, is like a customized storage inside the Active Directory. Really, the best analogy I can think of is that it's like a registry for the entire domain. So when we actually install some complex product that integrates heavily into Active Directory, typically we need to make space for that product by creating new entries in the schema, getting it ready to hold the new data that the program, in this case Exchange 2007, wants to store there. So a couple things to talk about in the situation in which we have some older environments. Let's start with if we have an older Exchange organization. So this isn't the first Exchange org. We've basically had Exchange 2000 or Exchange 2003. We need to basically run setup. This is the same setup that we run to install Exchange 2007, but we run setup from the command line, adding this command line switch, prepare legacy Exchange permissions. That will get the permissions that are on different objects in the Active Directory, registry settings, files, really primarily the Active Directory, ready to allow the new Exchange 2007 settings themselves to land without issues. If we've got some older Windows 2000 domain controllers, whenever we run any of these setups with the command line switches, we usually need to specify which domain controller we're going to make these changes on. Remember how we talked about there needing to be a Windows 2003 server with Service Pack 1 or R2 that was also wearing the schema master role or hat? that would be the server that we need to be pointing at in that case. So I might do setup / domain controller and then the name of that server, and then I might add my other switch like prepare schema, prepare legacy exchange permissions, prepare AD. Okay, moving on. One thing we will need to do is run setup with this prepare schema switch attached. Now, the nice thing is, after that, we would have to install prepare AD, use setup with prepare AD switch. Now, if we run prepare AD first without having run prepare schema, it will actually take care of this whole piece of the setup. So we can go straight to prepare AD knowing that it's going to go ahead and take care of that for us. Okay, there's one last thing I need to tell you about before we go in and actually run these switches and do these operations. Now, if we're going to be running setup, and setup is for Exchange 2007, and Exchange 2007 is a 64-bit product, the setup program is actually 64-bit as well, and we can't just go on the domain controller and run setup, since it's a 32-bit operating system and will not run the setup program. That means we're either going to need to do one of two things. Either we need to go ahead and join the other server to the domain and run setup on it, or we need to download and use another 32-bit trial edition of Exchange 2007 and use that 32-bit environment to actually get these schema preparations accomplished. Now, we will talk more about the 32-bit trial edition of Exchange 2007, not right now, but that's going to probably be more work than it needs to be because we don't really need those Exchange tools on the domain controller. Probably the best thing would be to take this time to go ahead and join the other server to the domain. So that's what I actually like to do next. All right, let's open up the mail server console. Do a quick login. We're going to need to join this workstation to the domain, like I said before. So let's do that first. We're going to go to the my computer. Quickly take care of this. And once we've done that, we're going to have to do a restart, but I'll pause the video so it doesn't take your time. There we go. And we'll go ahead and do that. I'm going to pause the video now. Okay, we're going to connect back to the server again, but while we're doing that, I need to point out that there's a requirement that needs to be met if we want to be able to run setup, even to make those schema changes on the server. And that requirement is that we have to have .NET Framework 2.0 loaded and PowerShell. One of the easiest ways to get those things is to actually just run the main Exchange setup. And note that within this setup screen, it gives us the option to install the .NET Framework. So we're going to go ahead and do that. That's going to take us to the Microsoft Download site, and we'll go ahead and grab that page here. You know what I like to do here? I like to throw an asterisk in there so that from now on I don't get asked to do that for any Microsoft site. So at this point I need the .NET Framework 2.0 redistributable package, and I'm going to download the x64 version. And I'm going to pause this while it's downloading. Alright, that finished downloading. Let's just go ahead and run it. And this can take a while to run, so I'm going to pause it here as well. I've got this wizard to work through. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to actually pause this, accept all the defaults till the end. Okay, we finished up with the installation of the .NET Framework. Let's do a bit of cleanup here. All right. Go back to Exchange Setup. I'm going to close Setup and open it up again. And we should see that install.NET Framework went gray, and now we've got to install the Windows PowerShell component. Because we're running an R2 edition of the server, we don't need to do this MMC install. That already comes with it. But let's go ahead and run PowerShell setup. This process is going to be similar to the .NET Framework, but it's not going to take as long. So let's go ahead down to the bottom to the download. So we need the download for PowerShell 1, not for XP, but for Windows 64, Windows 2003 64-bit edition. So let's download that. I'm going to pause this. All right, here we are. I'm going to go ahead and run the setup. And this won't take nearly as long as the .NET Framework. The .NET Framework setup that you got to see move by so quickly, that really took about 35 minutes. So don't be surprised if it seems to be taking forever. 35 minutes is kind of forever in our way of doing things sometimes. All right, there we go. And let's close out of this. At this point, there's nothing between us and installing Exchange, but we still need to do our schema upgrades and changes. So let's bring up the command line. And we're going to go into the D drive where the setup program is. And at this point, we're going to do setup /prepare AD. And then we need to add this switch for organizational name. And the organizational name we're going to use is 3CG. Very simple. We'll see that in several places once we've actually installed Exchange 2007. So we kick this off, and I'm going to actually pause this, and you'll be able to see the results at the end, because this sometimes takes a minute or two. Aha, this is interesting. Part of the schema change was to go ahead and check the prerequisites and make sure everything was good. We talked about how the domain needs to be in native mode and not mixed mode. This says it is in mixed mode. So we're going to go ahead and double check that again. We can do that together, actually, by switching back to the other server to take a look. Remember how we did that? We went into Administrator Tools, Domains and Trusts. Right-click this, say Raise Domain Functional Level. Should be at, oh, I see. When we looked at this before, we read that this was Windows 2000 native, but current domain functional level is Windows 2000 mixed. So we should have clicked Raise back then instead of thinking that our options were just between 2000 and 2003. So not sure why I missed that. I'm going to go ahead and raise that level now. And now I'm going to jump out of here, go back to the mail server, and we're going to run that command again. And I'm going to pause it, and I'll show you the results in a minute. All right, that finished. You know, that actually took about 12 to 15 minutes to complete. Now that we're done with that, we're going to actually head back to our outline. And it looks like we're about ready to go to readiness check. But before we do that, I just wanted to note the prepare domain switch. The prepare domain switch is only used if we have more domains, child domains, related domains in the same forest as this domain that we've just prepared. Doing prepare AD on a single domain takes care of everything. We don't normally need to do a prepare domain. Another thing that I'd like to know before we move on from here is you actually have to be a top-level administrator as far as permissions go. You have to have membership of the enterprise admins and schema admins group. If you're using your domain administrator's account, which I'm assuming you would be if you just started your own domain, then you're not going to have any trouble running these. But if you have lesser permissions, maybe you're a server operator or you've been given rights over a certain subdomain, if you try to run these schema change scripts, they're probably going to fail if you don't have those top-notch rights. Okay, we're going to go into the readiness check phase. At this phase, we're going to actually download the Exchange Best Practices Analyzer from the Microsoft Download site and run that. Before we do that, there's two requirements. One is that we have .NET 1.1 installed. Yeah, you'd think that since you have .NET 2.0, you wouldn't need 1.1, but you do have to go and install that. So I'm going to do that behind the scenes so you don't have to wait through that. The other thing we're going to need to do to get the Practices Analyzer to install properly is to install the IIS common files. So I'm going to show you what we need to do that. We're going to go into Control Panel, Add Remove Programs, and choose Windows Components. And from the list that comes up, we're going to go to Applications. Okay, come on here. There we go. Application Server, go into Details, choose IIS, go into Details, just choose Common Files, and I'm going to go ahead and click OK on that. And OK all the way out. And I'm going to go ahead and pause it right here and resume when it's finished. Okay, that's finished. Let's go ahead and verify that that completed. Good. All right, what we can do now is go ahead and download the Best Practices Analyzer and install it. I'm going to go to the Exchange Server 2007 Downloads page at Microsoft. I'm going to click on the Exchange Analyzers link and download XBPA version 2.8. And let's download that. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video until we get to into the actual running of the tool. Spare you the wait. Here we go. Let's go ahead and agree to their license. Go ahead and install it on the C drive. And there's a data directory that's going to be created. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and launch the tool now. While we're waiting, we'll do a little cleanup, close some web pages and things. All right, here we are in the Best Practices Analyzer. Let's go ahead and connect to Active Directory first. It's going to go ahead and ask us the directory server, which is going to be our only domain controller. So we'll go ahead and connect to that. And it's going to basically do some checks on that and make sure it's in good shape. Now, it gives us the chance to do a new scan. And one of the things we want to do, at least right now, is run this Exchange 2007 readiness check. So I'm going to go ahead and have that readiness check selected, leave that LAN setting there, and go ahead and start scanning. We'll see what we get as far as results. And let's go ahead and view the report. Okay. Let's go ahead and look in here. And let's look at the informational items. Looks like everything that they've found is informational. Nothing is actually any sort of warning about something we've missed as far as what we need. And really, since I see no red or yellow anywhere, means that we're pretty much ready to run the install. Let's go back to our OneNote outline and see where we're going to be going next. Next location we're going to go is into the editions area to look at the difference between the two editions. Now, in the past, with Exchange 2000 and 2003, Microsoft changed the name of what the mail was actually stored in from the word database to the word store. But now with 2007, the group has decided to change it back from store to database. So we're going to be talking about storage groups and databases that can be stored inside storage groups. The difference between the standard and enterprise editions are basically about how many storage groups and databases can be kept. Whereas the database limit, which used to be one of the features of the standard edition, is no longer there. Both of the types or editions have a standard or a theoretical limit, I would say, of 16 terabytes of data. Would you want to manage a 16 terabyte database or even a 1 terabyte database? I sure wouldn't. That's why we're able to create more than one database so that if one database goes corrupt, we can then be restoring just that database and have the others online. There's no great bragging rights to having a database that's too large. It's just going to be more hassle in the end. Anyway, going back to the difference between the editions, you can see up to 5 storage groups versus up to 50. Databases up to 5. Now you can put up to 5 storage groups in a, I'm sorry, up to 5 databases in a storage group. Does that mean that you can have up to 25 databases on standard? No, it doesn't. It just means you could have up to 5 storage groups, each one holding one database. Typically what you want to do is just create a storage group for each database. You don't necessarily want to load up one storage group with a whole bunch of them. As far as the enterprise side, we get up to 50 instead of just the 5 limit. We talked about database limit and how we're not limited there anymore. And then as far as clustering goes, we're going to have a whole chapter on clustering later on, really focusing on something called local continuous replication, which is really a way to keep an offline copy of the database that's usually pretty up to the minute on an extra drive or something, so that if there's a failure, you can just copy that over into the place where your live database was and bring up the store, and away you go. There are 2 or 3 other forms of clustering that come with the Enterprise Edition that we won't be covering, which are kind of more of the standard clustering options that you might get with enterprise servers. Okay, moving over to CAL types, or client access licenses. There's 2 kinds of client access licenses. Automatically, when you buy CALs for any user, you have to have a standard CAL. A standard CAL gets every user the ability to access the mailbox, the ability to use Outlook Web Access, and the ability to connect via mobile device, or Exchange Active Sync in this case. Now, the Enterprise CAL is not a separate CAL that you could choose to purchase instead of the standard. It's an add-on CAL. So if you have 200 standard CALs, and you want to give all of your users these functionalities, you would have to, in addition, buy 200 Enterprise CALs. What are the Enterprise CAL add-ons? Well, you've got unified messaging, like we talked about in the first or second video. The ability to take phone calls essentially on your Exchange server and save voicemail messages as email items. And that's just the beginning. We've got managed folders. We won't go into them now, but they're basically folders that you can set all sorts of rules and scripting against and control really what kind of content ends up in them and for how long. Advanced journaling, which is really most of the time has to do with the ability to archive all the mail, inbound or outbound, for compliance reasons, and we'll talk about that more later. And then lastly, you're going to need an Enterprise CAL if you're going to implement Microsoft's Forefront antivirus security. Basically, Forefront antivirus comes for free with the Enterprise CAL, and it's Microsoft's answer to handling mail antivirus. If you'd like to get some comparison of the actual cost, we can actually go to the Microsoft site, Exchange site, and check out the cost comparison there. Okay, come on. There we go. And we'll scroll down to this bottom area and we can kind of see the comparison. The standard CAL costs $67, and you can use the standard CAL to connect to either the standard edition or the Enterprise edition. The difference between standard and Enterprise do not have direct linkages to the difference between the standard and Enterprise CALs. So you can have Enterprise edition and 3000 standard CALs. It's just if you want to run those special features up on the Enterprise edition that you would actually end up having to add on the extra $25 CAL. So really, you're looking at 90 some odd dollars to $93 or so, $92 to run the standard and Enterprise CALs, as opposed to just 67 for the standard by itself. All right, let's wrap up this chapter. Okay, we've really covered a lot in this video, probably more than we're going to cover in many of the videos we're going to do after this. Where have we been? We've gone over hardware requirements and disk recommendations. We talked about spindles. We talked about the effect that 64-bit architecture is going to have on our memory and disk usage. We went through setting up DNS. We worked on DNS on the inside, setting up a forward lookup zone by doing DC promo and having that take care of our records for us. Then we also registered a domain name and set up a few DNS items up on GoDaddy's DNS control panel. We installed Active Directory. We did that domain registration. We did upgrade the schema by doing the prepare AD along with the setup program, and we had to install a few prerequisites along the way too. We then ran the readiness check and came out clean, and we also examined additions and cals. So we really hit all those things. We are primed and ready to go ahead now and run the actual setup. So let's do that in the next video.